Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm very excited to be here in this beautiful new building of the California Academy of Sciences, and also to be sponsored by the Leakey Foundation. I remember still vividly when I was at that local university down there a long time ago in the 70s, attending symposia organized by the Leakey Foundation. And at that time, it was just the beginning of an incredible shift and debate about the exact position of humans in the ape family tree. And the prevailing view was that humans diverged from the apes at least 15 million years ago. This was on the basis of anatomical differences. But there was Alan Wilson at Berkeley who was introducing new molecular techniques to look at similarities, molecular similarities, and with a molecular clock, he proposed that humans diverged only 5 million years or so from the other apes. And the two sides gave their talks and were implacably, they just were scoffing at each other as being right or wrong. In fact, with the molecular evidence and DNA evidence, we now know that humans fall right within the great ape family tree, and that the divergence of chimpanzees from humans is somewhere around 5 to 7 million years ago. So it was wonderful to go to those debates. But even before that, in 1960, Louis Leakey was very keen to find out more about the behavior of the great apes because he felt this would give insight into the behavior of human ancestors. And so, as we've heard, he sent out Jane Goodall to study chimpanzees. It was a very good choice. He sent her to the Gombe Stream Reserve, as it then was, on the eastern side of Lake Tanganyika in Tanzania. Now, Western Tanzania is the complete eastern edge of the chimpanzee range. Chimpanzees are distributed all across equatorial Africa. So what I want to do tonight is give you an overview of this incredible study that was started in 1960, and I'll talk about some of the key discoveries that have been made in those 50 years, showing similarities and differences between chimpanzees and humans. And then I'm going to talk about how new technologies have helped us look at questions that people didn't even dream of looking at, that would be possible to be answered in the 1960s. And at the end, I'm going to talk about conservation of this population. So when Jane first got to Gombe, the chimps were extremely scared of her. They ran away, and she spent every day trekking through the hills and often sitting on hilltops because it's a very rugged place, so it's possible to sit on the hill and look down into the valley and see chimps moving through the valleys, feeding in the trees. And she did this every day and came home at night and wrote up her notes. In the first year, the first few months, she made two very exciting discoveries that we've heard about. One of them, the first was actually that chimpanzees eat meat and hunt and eat meat and share meat. And she saw this from her position on the peak, this hilltop where she could look down into the trees below. She saw chimps eating a bush pig. Before that, it was thought that chimpanzees were largely vegetarian, so seeing them eating meat was exciting. But a month or so later, even more exciting, she saw, as we just saw in the film, a male making and using a tool to fish for termites. Now, of course, she was not able to get anywhere near to photograph these, as I'm showing you now, these behaviors. But the world was excited, and the National Geographic were interested in continuing to fund her research. but they had to get pictures and films. So they sent a photographer, with Louis Leakey's help, Hugo van Lawick, to film the chimps and film Jane's work. Around about the same time, a chimpanzee stole a banana from Jane's camp while she was up in the hills every day. So she asked her cook to put bananas out in her camp, hoping that other chimps would also come and it would be possible to watch them at closer quarters. And this worked, and eventually they set up a permanent feeding station up in the hills where chimps came in increasing numbers and ate bananas. So this provided an incredible opportunity to watch these chimps as they got used to people at very close quarters and really see details of their behavior. So Jane named the chimps and she described their personalities. This is David Greybeard, the first chimp who really allowed her to get close to him and accepted her. He's quite a calm male. This was Leakey, a somewhat more irascible male, quite mature. This is young female Melissa with her very newborn infant, Goblin. These are famous chimps I'm sure many of you have read about. And then here's 6-year-old Fifi with David Greybeard. And she was able to watch the complex social behavior that chimps show. So here are males and a female spending time grooming. Chimps spend quite a lot of time grooming each other. And there's quite a bit of aggression, especially males often do charging displays at other chimps to intimidate them, and all their hair stands on end. They may drag and objects, throw rocks, and intimidate each other that way. And the males can usually be ranked in a dominance hierarchy with a clear alpha male. And when Jane first got there, the alpha male was Goliath. But soon, a small but wily male, Mike, figured out how to use human objects to really embellish his displays. And so he would drag buckets and bat oil cans in front of him, which made a huge noise and very nicely intimidated everybody else. So Mike became the alpha male, receiving respect from young males, adult females. And it became clear how very similar these gestures that chimps use are to human gestures. Here are two adult males doing a long-distance pant hoot, calling and holding each other. The youngsters often play, and when they play, they have a play face showing their lower teeth, which is quite a lot like a smile. And they laugh as well. They make a kind of guttural laugh, which is quite a lot like ours when they play. They sometimes play with other species as well. These are both playing. The baboon has a play face as well. And sometimes the adults play. When times are good, they play as well. There is some behavior, though, which is very different from humans. Sexual behavior in chimps is quite different. In the sense, females get these large sexual swellings. They have a sexual cycle of about 36 days, and for 10 or 12 of those days, the female has this big pink swelling. And during that time, she mates repeatedly with all of the males in the group. Males usually initiate, they beckon or otherwise show the female they're interested in mating. Mating is a very public affair, and it lasts only about 5 or 7 seconds. And the female may mate just with one male after another. Jane was also able to watch infant development by really filming and photographing, watching this old female flow almost daily with her infant Flint. And Jane has written a lot about these famous chimps in her books and articles. She was a very tolerant and playful mother, babies start out riding on their mother's bellies, but then they go up onto their backs. And Flo had older children as well. So here is Fifi, age about 6, who was always with Flo, playing with Flint, sometimes carrying him. And then Flo also had an older son, Figan, who here is about 12, and the whole family were often together. And it became clear that family bonds last for a very long time. In fact, we now know they last for life between mothers and sons, and sometimes between mothers and daughters. And Jane said that they clearly have emotions, and we can see behavior and expressions that look like emotions we can readily recognize. Here's an infant being weaned. It's not fun. So fairly quickly, Jane realized that this was going to be a long-term study, and she started to employ assistants, and she, in the next few years, built up a vigorous research center which had assistants who helped with the daily observations, permanent buildings. And I got to Gombe in 1970 as an assistant, and then I stayed on as a graduate student, and I worked there on and off for the next 5 years. You can tell it's the 70s. Here are some of the students. That by this time, there were graduate students studying a number of specialized topics of chimp behavior and also baboon behavior. And increasingly, we were helped and assisted by Tanzanian field assistants. These are men who come from the local villages. They only had a few years schooling, but enough to be able to record data. And of course, very adept at getting around in the tough terrain. And many of these men had incredibly detailed botanical knowledge, knowing all of the plant species in the park, and so were very helpful in helping us identify the diet of the chimps. So by the early 70s, Tanzanian field assistants were helping collect the data all day, and which was very fortunate, as it turned out, because the foreign students' presence at Gombe came to an abrupt end when 4 students were kidnapped by a rebel group from Congo, Zaire. They came across the lake, took 4 students. They were eventually released, but Gombe was then declared unsafe for white researchers. But Jane was able to keep the study going for the next 15 years, well, until the present, but with Tanzanian field assistants who were collecting the daily data, and still are. So in the early 70s, the methodology switched from just watching these chimps as they came to the feeding area to following them wherever they went. They were now completely used to people and would allow us to follow them on their daily travels. And in the early 70s, the following technique was developed where 2 people go out, follow a chimp all day. They select a particular focal chimp, they follow him or her all day, and record data on them. And then the next day they follow someone else. And this has been going on ever since the early 1970s. And these are the kind of data they collect. The top check sheet has all of the possible chimps they will meet across the top. Every line of the check sheet is a 15-minute interval, so they record, in this case, the following Fanny, and she has a full swelling, so she's red in there. And they meet other chimps during the day. And every 15 minutes, they also record where the group is on a map. And they write down what the chimp they're following is doing, as well as other major events that occur, like hunts, all the mating, big dominance interactions, and so on. So this following allowed us to learn much more about what chimps did during the day and sex differences, and eventually about group structure. Every night, chimps make a new nest. They make a nest in the tree, sleep all night, get up in the morning, travel, and then they make a new nest wherever they end up in the evening. It turns out that females spend quite a bit of time alone just with their offspring, and they tend to spend that time in fairly small areas which they know very well and to which where they feed and travel year after year. And each female has her distinct core area which overlap with the core areas of other females. But they sometimes join the males and travel more widely. Male chimps travel more widely in general. Here is a group of males. There are some females in there who join them for some period of the day. And cycling females, swollen females, tend to be with the males. So in the early 1970s, well, when Jane first got there, she felt from her observations that all the chimps in the national park, so the reserve, which became a national park, is shown in black here, that she felt that they all knew each other and interacted on the whole peacefully. But even in the 1960s, another scientist, Toshisato Nishida, who was a Japanese scientist working further south in Mahale Mountains in Tanzania, had already noted from his observations that chimps seem to live in permanent large groups which have antagonistic relations, which often chase and fight each other. And it became clear that the Gombe chimps did this as well in a series of observations that unfolded in the early 1970s. So on this map, the star is the location of the feeding area, and the red hatches, this is the area that we were following the chimps in that came to the feeding area in the early 70s. Now, during that time, the group coming to the feeding area started to split into two distinct subgroups. And the southern subgroup became less and less, and when they did come to the feeding area, there was a lot of excitement. Here's a picture I took of the males in the northern subgroup hearing the southern group coming. They're screaming, they're hanging onto each other, and this was a scary thing that the southern males were coming to the feeding area. In 1971, David Bygott, following males from the northern subgroup, saw them attack a female he'd never seen before in the south and kill her infant. This was the first lethal attack seen, and it was quite shocking to we didn't know that chimps did this. After this, the subgroups became even more distinct. We called the red, the northern subgroup, the Kasakela group, and Kahama is the southern group. And when we followed these chimps, as they came to the edge of their range, they would often get into what we call patrolling mode, where they become silent and travel slowly and then stop and look into the range beyond. And when they met individuals from the other group, they would often display at each other or pant hoot at each other, and then they would go back the way they came into their own range. But in 1974, there were two observations of groups of the Kasakela community finding single males or males in small groups from the Kalandi community and brutally attacking them, launching gang attacks where some of the males held the male down, others bit and pulled him, and each of these males was very badly wounded, never seen again. In 1975, there were two more attacks, one on an adult male, one on an adult female, both never seen again. In 1977, the last two males of the Kahama group were killed. And so this was, Jane called it the 4-year war, which ended in the complete annihilation of the males of the Kahama community. A couple of females from that community eventually reintegrated into the Kasakela community. By this time, we knew that they were also having aggressive interactions with chimps in the north and in the south, and we now call those communities that live in the north and the south Mitumba in the north, Kalandi in the south. These were completely unhabituated, so these chimps would run away if they saw people. So for a couple of years after the Kahama community went extinct, the Kasakela community had quite a big range, but then it started to shrink, and 3 males disappeared from the Kasakela community, and we suspected that the same sort of thing had happened to them. So these 2 outer communities, Mitumba and Kalandi, pressed the Kasakela community, so it shrank, and there came a point when Jane was really concerned that the same fate may befall the Kasakela community. But they managed to persist, and eventually the Kasakela community expanded. So now 2007, it has a very large range. The Mitumba and the Kalandi community have smaller ranges. We didn't know for sure in the 1970s and 80s how many chimps there were in Mitumba and Kalandi, but we suspect that the numbers were reduced as they lost habitat outside the park that they'd probably used before. So now in 2010, the situation is pretty much like we see in 2007. The Mitumba community was habituated, so became habituated for following, and so that we can now follow all of the Mitumba chimps as well since the 1990s. So we're able to watch Kasakela Mitumba, and we know something about the Kalandi community too from monitoring them, and I'll talk a little bit more later about collecting feces and identifying chimps that way. In the early 1970s, it also became clear that male chimps stay for life in the community that they're born in. So here are Atlas and Prof, both born in the community after the beginning, the Kasakela community after the beginning of the study, and both of them died a few years ago. They lived there all their lives. It also became clear that females often leave the community that they're born in. So when they reach adolescence, they go off and join another community before they start breeding. And this is the case in all chimp populations that have been studied. And in most other populations, besides Gombe, almost all the females leave. But in Gombe, in Kasakela, about half the females actually stay in their group. Here's a female called Shwini, who was rather a small female. She tried to immigrate into the Mitumba community, but she was severely attacked by the resident females there. You can see a big wound on the top of her head. She tried twice, but in the end she ended up coming back and settling in Kasakela. This pattern of males staying and females leaving is quite different from what we see in most other primates, like these baboons, and indeed most social mammals. In baboons, females stay all their lives in the group they're born in, but males leave and join other troops. And we think this pattern of one sex or the other leaving before breeding is an inbreeding avoidance mechanism. So what's very interesting is that when we see that male chimps stay in their natal communities with their brothers and their fathers and their relatives. They are territorial, they defend their territories. And this, in many ways, resembles what we see in a lot of human societies, where men also tend to stay where they're born, and women often marry into other groups. And many of us, think that it's quite probable that the common ancestor also had this pattern of male philopatry and female dispersal, but not every. This is a topic of some debate at the moment. So in 1986, Jane wrote this incredibly wonderful book, this scientific compendium of what was known of the behavior of the Gombe chimps up to that point. In a celebration of the publication of this book, there was a conference in Chicago which gathered together researchers on chimps in other parts of Africa and also in the US. And as Jane has talked about this, she went in as a scientist to this conference and she came out as an activist. She was so appalled to hear about the plight, the conservation plight of chimps in other parts of Africa, and also the plight of chimps in the entertainment industry and in labs, that she felt she had to use her influence to improve to advocate for chimps, and more generally, as we've seen in the film, to advocate for stewardship of the planet. And this is what every day now she travels the world and talks 300 days a year. So she kept the study going, of course, at Gombe, but the data continued to be collected. But she had much less time to analyze the data. It's stacked up in her house in Dar es Salaam on shelves. And in the early 90s, we decided that we should bring the data to the US, where we could put to bear lots of assistants to work on the analysis, and also be able to do computer analysis in ways that Jane hadn't been able to do in Tanzania. So we brought the data to the University of Minnesota and set up the Jane Goodall Institute Center for Primate Studies. And as you heard, I've just moved to Duke, and we've now moved the data to Duke. And we have around about 25 filing cabinets full of the kind of data I showed you, the field notes, of this amazing 50-year study of the chimps. And what I've been doing for the last 20 years or so is to supervise students in actually entering data off this paper into computer databases so that we can analyze years of data from Gombe and look at things like range changes, as I showed you, but many other things like patterns of hunting, rise and fall of different alpha males, and so on. And this very important daily collection of notes is continuing at Gombe. It's taken us, though, even now, a very long time to understand the complete life histories of chimps because they develop so slowly. But now we're beginning to know how long chimps live in the wild. This is Goblin, who was born in 1964. He died in 2004, at the age of almost 40. We now know that males don't seem to live much beyond their early 40s. Females live a bit longer. Here's Fifi, who was first seen at the beginning of the study when she was about 6. And she lived a very successful life, having many offspring. And then she disappeared in 2004. We actually suspect that she may even have been attacked by Mitumba chimps, because we'd seen the Mitumba chimps attack another female in that same year, who later died. We don't know what happened to Fifi, but she still looked good. Here she is a month or so before she disappeared. Contrast that with the appearance of her mother, Flo, just a month before she died. Flo's teeth were worn completely to the gums. Fifi's were not. So if Fifi was 46, Fifi was 46 when she disappeared. Flo, we think, must have been at least in her 50s, if not her 60s. Now, putting all this information on life history together, my colleague Melissa Emery, who is here, has looked at the life history, the survival lifespan of chimpanzees and also birth rates in chimpanzees and compared these to humans. So in this graph, the dotted line shows survival of adult females, and you can see that most females have died by the time they're 40, and a few live into their 50s. Now, the solid line shows birth rates of females of different ages. So females have their first baby when they're somewhere between, when they're around about 14 years old. And then they have a baby roughly every 5.5 years at Gombe, if the previous infant survives. So pretty long birth spacing. And they go on having babies, although the rate reduces as they get older. They go on having babies pretty much till they die. And in fact, Flo, however old she was, she had a baby 3 years before she died. So now look at these patterns in humans, and this is just one society of humans, the Arche hunter-gatherer society in Paraguay. This is Melissa put this together, and the scale is actually different. So where the chimps the ages go from 0 to 54, down here for humans it goes from 0 to 74. So if you look at survival, these women are often surviving into their 60s and some into their 70s. But then look at the birth rate curve. Humans, of course, have their first baby later. Here it's about when they're about 19, 20. But once they start having babies, the interbirth interval is much shorter, and then they stop having babies. We stop having babies by the time we're in our 40s, and yet live for another 20 years or so. So this is a very interesting and striking but different pattern between humans and chimps, which we've only really been able to put together recently because we're only recently getting enough data to see what the situation is in chimps. My colleague David Haig compared one chimp and one person just to emphasize this difference. So here again is Fifi, who had her first baby when she was 13, her last baby when she was 44, and died when she was 46. Here's Emma Darwin, who didn't have her first baby until she was 31. Her last baby was born when she was 48, and then she lived to be 88. They had about the same number of kids, and here on the same scale, from birth to death, is Fifi and Emma. So what's happened in human life history is that there's a longer period of development before breeding, then there's short interbirth intervals, so people have a lot of children in a short time, but then they live for a long time afterwards. So there's a lot of interest and debate about why that different life history has evolved in humans. We might talk about that later, but now I want to go on and talk about how some new technologies have helped us look at things that we really can't do with just observation and pencil and paper. One thing that's changed is, you saw Hugo's cameras. They had to be on a tripod. With the increasing miniaturization of video cameras, we can now record behavior and then play it back again and again and really look at the details of what's going on. This is Elizabeth Lonsdorf, who studied the development of termite fishing. You've already seen films of termite fishing. By this time, she did this work in the late 90s. It was clear that chimpanzees in different populations use tools in different ways for different purposes. And so it's clear that there are local traditions, and the chimps must in some way be learning from others in their group how to use a tool in a particular way. So she was interested in the process of development of this skill and whether there was any sort of teaching that goes on. So Elizabeth was able to play these films over again and again, and she recorded everything that each did, how long they watched, who they watched, and so on. And she found that little females spend a lot of time watching, and they watch their mothers mostly, almost entirely. This is kind of unusual. They watch their mothers, and then they try to termite fish themselves. It takes almost 3 years before they get their first termite out of the mound. The mothers don't teach them at all. There's no sort of teaching. They're just watching and trying themselves. But it's interesting that she found that the females learned this more quickly. They were better at it. And also the females, their behavior resembled their mothers more closely than the sons did. So some females use tools of different lengths. The mother here, Gremlin, uses very long tools. Her daughters also use long tools. But sons, they use tools of about the same length regardless of what their mother's doing. So somehow the females are getting a closer match to their mother's behavior than males are. Another scientist who's used video at Gombe is Ian Gilby, who was interested in how meat is shared or not by possessors of meat. So he filmed males with meat and looked at sharing. Let me set the scene here. The male holding this is a bushbuck, is Frodo, the alpha male at the time. In the tree, there are 2 adult females, and there's also another 2 adult males. There's Goblin. I think he's behind at the moment. Goblin is an older male. He had been alpha. Then he was deposed, ostracized, quite badly wounded, but then he eventually rejoined the group. And his behavior ever since, until he died, was to sit very close to the alpha male. And in that way, he seems to be able to manipulate the behavior of other males and to dominate them. Another question that we've only recently been able to answer with new technology is, who are the fathers? Because females mate with all the males, it's very hard to know, and yet it's something of great interest to us because, males are that they challenge each other to become alpha. We assume that the alpha male probably does quite well in fathering infants. But this wasn't entirely clear. And when Jane wrote her book, she really went over all of the information that she had on mating behavior and who seemed to be having access to females when they were likely to be conceiving. And she concluded that, in fact, alpha males didn't seem to be getting the advantage you might expect, which seemed rather surprising. One of the things that may have led her to this conclusion was that a lot of the data she was looking at was from this male, Figan, when he was alpha. And in fact, when we look at his mating success compared to other males, he didn't look particularly good when he was alpha. This shows the percentage of all the matings that were recorded that males of different rank got. So Figan's on the far left, he's the alpha, and then the males are arranged in decreasing rank. So they're all getting a fair amount of mating. However, when we've more recently looked at mating patterns in now 7 different alpha males, Ian Gilby just recently did this. In fact, the alpha male in general does do pretty well compared to the others. But still, other males are mating with females as well as the alpha, and we really can't tell from this who get to be the fathers. So in the 90s, new techniques developed to do paternity testing by comparing DNA from infants with their parents and their father. But to begin with, those tests had to be done from tissue or blood, and of course there was no way we could collect samples from the chimps of that kind. Then people found ways of extracting DNA from hair and amplifying the DNA so that they could do paternity tests. And so at that point, people at Gombe started collecting chimp hair. And how do you collect a chimp's hair? Well, each chimp makes a new nest each night. And so if you know who got out of the nest, you can then climb up and painstakingly look for hair in the leaves. And this is what they did. Luckily, eventually, this was very hard, but they did manage to find hairs. Techniques then were developed to extract DNA from feces. Now, feces are a lot easier to collect, and you can follow a chimp until it defecates and then collect its feces. Chimps actually defecate several times a day. But it's kind of a messy business to extract DNA from feces. However, Julie Constable and then later Emily Wroblewski, who I think is here tonight, did this work and were able to determine who the fathers are of most of the infants and many of the chimps who now live in Gombe. So we can now ask, how do the alpha males make out? And so the red bars show a number of conceptions of males at different ranks, and the alpha males definitely do the best. But you can see that other males also do get to father young, even males as low ranking as rank 10. So how are they doing this? One way they seem to be able to do it is by taking a female away on a consortship from the rest of the group. And Jane always thought that this was certainly one way of being sure you're the father because there's nobody else there. And consortships certainly one way that males gain paternity. Also, young females are not so attractive to males as older females. So the lower ranking males can sometimes father the young of young females who are not yet attracting the higher ranking males. But now we know the fathers, we can also ask a lot of other questions. Now we know relationships now both through the mother and through the father. And so one question is, do the chimps know who is their father? And this is something that Emily has been working on recently. And so far she has found, intriguingly, that daughters do seem to know who their fathers are. We have some females who've stayed in the group and mate in the group. And it turns out that the females try very hard to avoid mating with their fathers, although fathers do try to mate with their daughters. So that raises lots of more questions. How do they know? And these are things that Emily is currently interested in looking at. Okay, well, I want to end. We know we've learned so much about chimps from these different, from all these years of watching them, but there's a lot more to learn, and they still do things which surprise us. And I want to end with this curious story of Gremlin, her daughter Gaia, and her grandchildren. I'll give you the events as they've unfolded in the last few years. So Gremlin was born in 1970, so she's almost 40 now, but we've known her since she was an infant. Here she is riding on her mother Melissa. A few years later, after Gremlin's birth, Melissa gave birth to twins. These were the first twins seen at Gombe. Gremlin was always with Melissa while she was caring for these twins. Unfortunately, one of them was always weak, Gaia, and he died within the first year, but Gimbal survived. So here's Gremlin with her mother Melissa and the twins. Well, Gremlin grew up, and she was one of the females who stayed in the group rather than emigrating. And here's Gremlin lying down, her brother, the surviving twin, Gimbal, behind her. Her son, Galahad, over here on the right, and here is her newborn infant, Gaia. Now, we know that Gaia is actually very lucky to be alive in this picture because videographer Bill Wallauer, I'll show you a picture of him in a minute, was bound and determined to observe Gremlin giving birth to Gaia. They knew she was pregnant, and so he followed Gaia for many days before she gave birth. And then eventually she was by herself, and she seemed to be rather keen to be by herself. She was always looking over her shoulder and seemed to be checking for other chimps. She climbed into a big nest, and he actually managed to film her giving birth. I don't have time to show you all this film. So she gave birth, and she stayed in that area for another day or two, and then some females came along, and the females were Fifi, Fanny, Gigi, and a couple of others. these were females who Gremlin knew very well. They all shared very similar ranges. But when Fifi and Fanny arrived and saw Gremlin up in the tree with her newborn baby, they attacked her. And they attacked her very determinedly for about 2 hours, but she stayed in the tree. She kept making huge jumps into other trees. They chased her. They tried to get her infant, especially Fifi. And this was very surprising, but not entirely unheard of, because back in the 70s, Jane had observed a mother and daughter, Passion and Pom, attacking and killing newborn infants of females in the group and actually eating the infants. This was very surprising to people. But even then, Jane felt that perhaps things like that had happened before. Females are nervous when they've given birth, and she looked back through the records and found some other unexplained disappearances. So female aggression towards new infants does sometimes happen. This time, Gremlin managed to get away, and Gaia survived. A few years later, Gremlin again gave birth, and she gave birth to twins, so twins seem to run in this family. Again, Bill was there, and here's Bill. He filmed another attack by Fifi. Fifi's here on the left. This is just a still from his video. Fanny is standing up, hitting Gremlin, who is crouched over her newborn twins here. Again, Gremlin was able to get away and preserved her twins. So here's Gremlin with the twins, and Gaia, who was a constant companion with Gremlin as she was raising these twins. These twins are both still alive. They're now grown up and mating. So these are the first case where both twins have survived. So Gaia grew up, and she stayed in the group as well, and she had a baby. And what happened then was quite surprising. So Emily was following Fanny and her family, and they met Gaia, who had this newborn infant and was with Gremlin. So Gaia had the infant, Gremlin was there with her 2-year-old, and Fanny came up the path towards them. And Gaia and Gremlin made nervous vocalizations. They got close together, and Gremlin took Gaia's infant. So here, this is just after it happened. So in the back is Fanny and her family. In the front, you've got Gremlin holding Gaia's infant, and then her 2-year-old behind her. Gaia never tried to take that infant back, and Gremlin kept it. So here she is nursing Gaia's infant with her 2-year-old trying to nurse as well. Later on, often as they traveled, Gaia would carry her little brother while her mother had her grandchild with her. And she did nurse this infant, but it never seemed to thrive, and it died after 5 months. So then Gaia got pregnant and gave birth again. This birth was not seen, but a day after the birth, Gaia was found carrying a dead infant. And this infant was wounded. In fact, it seemed to have been eaten to some extent. And Gremlin was present, and she took this baby from Gaia, against Gaia's will. Gaia was screaming, and Gremlin actually nibbled on the baby. So this was all very surprising. Gaia carried the baby for another day, and then she dropped it, and the observers were able to get it, and the body, and they were able to do a necropsy and realized that it was stillborn. It had never drawn breath. And so it had obviously not behaved like a baby right from the beginning. We don't know exactly what happened, but again, Gremlin took this baby for some of the time. Gaia got pregnant once more, and she gave birth to twins, so a third set of twins in this family. Shortly after the observers found her with twins, here she is with the twins. She wasn't very, one of them was seemed very weak and not making any noise. The other one was screaming, but it was because she was carrying it upside down. Shortly after they saw her with the twins, then she met Gremlin. And Gremlin took the twins. Gaia really screamed and tried not to let Gremlin take the twins, but Gremlin took both twins. Here's Gremlin with her grandsons. One of them she did nurse them, but one of them was very weak and died a couple of days later, and then the other one died about 10 days after that. By this time, here's Gremlin with the two twins and her poor 3-year-old son, who's yet again been displaced from nursing with his mother, and here's Gaia beside. So after Gaia had screamed and tried not to let Gremlin take the twins, she didn't try to get them back. So she gave birth again, and she stayed away from the group for several days. And when she did join the group, Gremlin did pay a lot of interest, but Guy was able to keep that baby close. And then a couple of months later, Gremlin gave birth. And here is Gremlin with her infant Gizmo and Gaia with her infant Goodall. And I'm very happy to say they're both still doing well. These were born last year. So what a strange story. And this is from there's a recent National Geographic article that just came out, which has a timeline of a number of chimps in it. But here I've just extracted a little bit of it. So Gremlin, just to summarize, she had Gaia. Gaia was attacked as a newborn by Fanny and Fifi. Gremlin later had the twins, Golden and Glitter. Again, there was an attack by Fanny and Fifi. Then she had Gimli. And then Gaia herself grew up, and she had her first infant, Godot. And this was, Gremlin took the infant as Fanny approached. And so a plausible explanation for this could have been that that Gremlin saw the threat of Fanny, who she knew would attack newborns, and that she was actually protecting her grandchild. But it's harder with the subsequent observations to sustain that explanation. I think Fanny wasn't always there. And it may be a simpler explanation that Gremlin had this extraordinary experience of having two infants for a very long time. Gaia was very involved in those. She often had one of Gremlin's infants. Gremlin was accustomed to taking infants back from Gaia. So who knows? But this is, we're glad that we finally have two surviving infants from this family. Well, I want to end by talking about the challenges and the threats facing these famous chimps in this small population at Gombe. We now know that disease is a big problem. Disease is the biggest killer of the chimps at Gombe, as it probably is in other populations as well. There are 3 panels here, but the middle one, this shows the population of the Cascala community from 1964 to 2008. And so you can see it's gone up and down. And then we've got the population numbers we think were in Matumba until we knew for sure because they were all habituated, and Kalandi community here. We now roughly know how many, we've known for the last decade or so how many there are there. These two Matumba and Kalandi communities probably, as I said, decreased in number because they lost habitat. But if we look at these bars, there have been epidemics of disease which have killed some of the chimps in the population. There was a polio epidemic in the early 60s. Then there was an epidemic of a pneumonia-like disease that killed several. There was a very bad epidemic in Cascala in 1987 that killed 8 or 9 individuals. Another one later on here. There was a bad respiratory epidemic in Matumba and one in Kalandi. Unfortunately, we now know that these kind of respiratory epidemics are very likely to come from people. And so this has been shown pretty clearly by identifying the virus in a population in West Africa. Another epidemic that occurred here in 1997 was mange. This is Fifi, actually, that some of the chimps got very sick with mange and some infants died. And this probably came from domestic animals. So obviously a major problem that we have to be very aware of and try to reduce is ourselves giving these chimps disease, especially respiratory diseases. And both at Gombe and I think all of the other populations where chimps are habituated, there are now rules about keeping a distance from chimps, not going near them if you're sick. And these are rules which we hope tourists will follow as well, and it's very important. Another disease which is does not originate from humans is SIV. In the last decade, we found that, working with Beatrice Hahn, we found that the Gombe chimps are infected to some extent with SIV, which is a precursor to HIV. SIV is endemic in chimpanzees across Africa, or at least across Central Africa, but it's not there in all populations. You'll find a population that does have it and then one that doesn't. But it is present in Gombe, the Gombe chimpanzees. There's only a few individuals infected in Matumba and Kasakela, but in Kalandi, there's high prevalence of SIV, and we suspect now that this decline in the Kalandi population over the last decade or so may even be due to SIV, which is a worrying thought. So what can we do? There is a great deal of health monitoring going on at Gombe now. Elizabeth Lonsdorf at the Lincoln Park Zoo has had in place for some time now a monitoring program where the health of the chimps is monitored daily, and samples are collected, fecal samples, so they can look at parasites. There's also a trained vet, Tanzanian vet, on hand. And she has, there are now solar-powered freezers so that if a chimp dies and we do find the body, the body can be stored until they can do a necropsy that really gets all the information we possibly can. We're also working with Beatrice Hahn to monitor SIV and follow its progress at Gombe. So there's now a well-equipped lab and a Tanzanian graduate student working at Glasgow University looking at parasites, and it's possible to do really thorough necropsies at Gombe. So we hope by these measures to learn as much as we can about health, and of course that should help us understand and control disease to the extent that's possible. The other big threat that the chimps, Gombe chimps face is habitat degradation outside the park. This is actually a very high image, a satellite image, high-resolution satellite image. This is another recent National Geographic article, and you can see very clearly the park, which is green, still has trees, and the lack of trees outside the park. The human population around Gombe is very high. The poverty is very great, and the population growth is high too, both from high birth rates and refugees coming in from other countries. Lillian Pintier used this, so another technological advance where we can actually use satellite pictures to monitor habitat change. He compared a satellite picture from 72 to one in 99 and compared the vegetation inside. It either increase, which is shown in green, this is an increase in canopy, more trees, and then red is a decrease, deforestation and conversion to farmland outside the park. So this is what the eastern edge of the park looked like in the early 2000s. So farmland coming all the way up to the edge of the park. But inside the park it's increased, probably because of protection from fire since it's been a national park. And the good news in this slide is that this is a forest reserve that is only 15 or 20 years old, used to be farmland, and yet the trees can grow back quickly. But up here, there was a forest reserve that's shown in white, is actually trees in this case. Most of that forest reserve is gone, and that's what we see, the remnant here. So there's great pressure around the park, and for the last 16 years, Jane has been very active in getting community conservation going in the villages around the park. So first with the Takari, or Take Care program, that started about 16 years ago, and then more recently the Greater Gombe Ecosystem Project, funded by USAID. There are teams working in all the villages around the park, educating about tolerance for wildlife, conservation, land management, sustainable agriculture, and then programs in health and family planning, and education and microcredit. They've been drawing up land management plans, and so each of these shows a different village land, and the green is areas that they have agreed to put aside as forest reserves, village forest reserves, so all along the back of the park and to the north, and all the way up to the Burundi border in the higher hills. The blue dots these blue dots show chimp sightings outside the park, so there are some chimps still seen outside the park, and especially in this area, but this is rather separated by very cultivated land from Gombe. So there's a lot of challenge here, but I think there's progress, some progress is being made, at least in helping the habitat around the park. So with all these measures, we certainly hope and expect that the Gombe chimps will continue to be there, and that we'll be able to study them for another 50 years and to find out far more than we know already about our closest living relatives. So to end, I would like to just highlight some of the enormous numbers of people who've worked on this project. In 2003, we had a Gombe reunion. This is just some of the people who have worked at Gombe over the years, people who were able to get to the reunion. Of course, there have been many Tanzanians working on the project as well. This is just a snapshot of the people working there from 2004, when Mike Wilson was the director of chimp research. But here are some of the field assistants. Some of these people worked on the project. Hilali, for example, up here, Eslam, Yahya, have worked on the project for over 35 years. They've fairly recently retired, and some of their sons are continuing to work, are working there now. Here's Rambo, who's Hilali's son. And finally, I'd like to introduce Deus Njungu, who is now the director of chimp research at Gombe. He was supported, he did his PhD at University of Minnesota, and he was supported by a Leakey Foundation Baldwin Fellowship. So it's really exciting that he's now there directing the research at Gombe. And of course, none of this would have been possible or happened without Jane. And many organizations have supported this study. These are just some of them, but Leakey Foundation has supported many of the students who've worked there, and most recently Deus. So I'd like to thank you very much.